Bruchim Abayim, welcome to Zooming into Tu Bishvat. This is the fourth holiday we're celebrating via Zoom. We had a large Tikkun Leil Shavuot in Hebrew and English, Rosh Hashanah, Chanukah, and now Tu Bishvat. So once we've passed three holidays, it's a chazaka. We have to continue doing this, and I hope that we will. It's nice to see people from all over Israel and from all over the world, and we hope that you will tell your friends and more people will join us in the future. My specific topic today, for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Golinkin. I'm the president of the Schechter Institutes Incorporated, and I teach Talmud and Halacha at Schechter in the graduate school and the rabbinical school. My topic today is the Jewish attitude towards the environment, some basic principles. Before I get to those principles, I'd like to explain why I'm talking about the environment, which might be muvan me'elav, it might be self-understood, but really it isn't. If you open up the Mishnah to the first Mishnah in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, it talks about Arba'a Rashi Shanim, that there are 4 new years, and one of them, of course, you know, which is Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei. And the last one is Be'echad Bishvat Rosh Hashanah La'ilan, on the first of Shvat, Rosh Hashanah for trees, according to Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel omrim b'chamisha asar bo. Beit Hillel say that the Rosh Hashanah for trees is on the 15th of Shvat, which is, of course, Tu Bishvat. This was not a holiday, no big deal. This was a technical divider for the purpose of giving ma'asrot, of giving the tithe. You had to know which fruit belonged to which year. And the cutoff date following Beit Hillel was the 15th of Shvat, Tu Bishvat, which meant that fruits that chantu means became formed. It's hard to exactly define what that means, but that had the form of fruit after or before Tu Bishvat, that determined which year they would go for the tithe of that year. In other words, you could not use the fruits shechantu, which took form after Tu Bishvat, for the tithe of the previous year. That was the modest beginning of Tu Bishvat. Tu Bishvat really took off as a holiday under the Kabbalists of Tzfat, of Safed, the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and his students. This was explained at length in the Ari's student, whose name was Rabbi Natan Azati, Rabbi Nathan of Gaza, and he wrote a book called Chemdat Hayamim. And part of that book was then excerpted and published for the first time in Salonika in 1753. And that book is called Pri Eitz Hadar, which means literally the fruit of the goodly tree, which is normally a phrase used in connection with the etrog on Sukkot. But Pri Eitz Hadar was the name of the booklet, including the Seder Tu Bishvat. I have here a Xerox of the first edition of Pri Eitz Hadar, Salonika 1753. And then it was reprinted innumerable times, and it became especially popular among Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews have a Seder Tu Bishvat. They drink 4 cups of wine, imitating the Pesach Seder, and I'm sure you can find examples of a Seder Tu Bishvat online, and I do a Seder Tu Bishvat every year, though it's very different from the one described by Rabbi Natan of Gaza. The third chapter in the history of Tu Bishvat was at the beginning of the 20th century. We already have mention of planting trees on Tu Bishvat in Russia. How exactly they did that in Minsk and Pinsk, I don't know. The ground is frozen at this time of year, but we have stories of Zionists going out to plant trees in 1906. In the land of Israel, in 1908, Histadrut HaMorim, the Union of Israeli Teachers, which still exists, decided that this shall be the annual day of tree planting for children. And by the time 1910 rolled around, in Hebrew Tafresh Ayin, there was already the young city of Tel Aviv, which had been founded in 1909. And in 1910, the children did not have to schlep off to Mikveh Yisrael, to the agricultural colony of Mikveh Yisrael, to plant trees. They planted trees in the city of Tel Aviv itself. A similar description of the tree planting by children in Tafresh Ayin Gimel 1913 at the town of Moza outside of Jerusalem. Whenever you drive on the main road to Tel Aviv, you pass by Moza. And then, of course, the holiday took off as a holiday for planting trees. But we're now at the fourth stage, or the fourth chapter of the history of Tu Bishvat. And Tu Bishvat has become a day on which we talk about ecology, the environment, or sustainability, depending on which decade. In the 70s, we called it ecology, then we called it the environment, and now we call it sustainability. And therefore, I decided that to celebrate Tu Bishvat with you this year, I would like to present 5 basic principles or ideas related to the environment in Judaism. They are taken from a responsive of mine, which you can read online. The English version appeared in this book, Response in a Moment, Volume 2. The Hebrew version in my book, Aseh L'charav Shelot Utshuvot. The specific question was, is it permissible to open a new phosphate quarry near Arad? And unfortunately, I don't have time to teach that part of the responsum. And by the way, it's absolutely forbidden, even though the Israeli government in the end did it. But before I got to the phosphate quarry near Arad, I presented 5 basic concepts about the environment in Judaism, and I would like to share that with you at this time. So I'm going to pull up the screen. As an introduction, I quoted a cantata written by my father, Rabbi Noah Golinkin of blessed memory, called Shabbat and Ecology in the 1970s. And he wrote, I wanted to smell the fragrance of flowers, but all I smelled was the exhaust from cars. I wanted to see the sunset, all I saw was haze and smog. I wanted to see the flowing brook, all I saw was brown water, a floating can, the fish were dead. I wanted to see the mountain, but I saw the strip of a coal mine. In place of a sunrise, I saw the shape of modern high-rise apartments, and I could see the sun no more. My eyes, my ears, my nostrils, and my lungs were contaminated. My food was contaminated by civilization. Everything around me has changed. I don't recognize the environment, the beautiful things that God has created. If this was true in the early 1970s, Kal Vachomer, how much more so is it true today? And in this responsum, published in 2008, I gave a number of specific examples. Unfortunately, the examples abound. I want to read you a recent article from 2019 from The Economist. One paragraph. 1 million species of animals and plants are threatened with extinction. 3/4 of the world's land and 2/3 of its marine environment have been significantly altered by human action. Urban areas have doubled in size in just the past 30 years. More than 85% of wetlands have been lost. More than 90% of ocean fish stocks are being harvested at or above sustainable levels. These are among claims made in a report published on May 6, 2019 by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity, etc., etc. Anybody who checks the internet can find more alarming statistics such as these. So I would like to present 3 basic principles of the Jewish view of ecology, and then 2, one practice, one minhag, and the other a halachic concept which has had a tremendous influence on Jewish law. The first basic principle regarding ecology is that our earth and the entire universe belong to God, which of course is contrary to the way many people in the world, both in the Western world and perhaps in the more primitive world, viewed the earth. The common conception was that this land is your land, this land is my land, that this land belongs to me, and that I can do whatever I want with my land that I purchased, and whether it's my backyard or my farm, and the idea that the land that I own, or the land on which my house is standing, or on which this building, the Schechter Institute, is standing, that this belongs to God, is a foreign concept to many modern people. And at that time, I wrote, this past year was the sabbatical year. Well, this coming year, in the land of Israel is going to be the sabbatical year starting on Rosh Hashanah. And the central verse about Shemitah, or the sabbatical year, is in Vayikra chapter 25. Ve'aretz lo timacher litzmitut ki li kol haaretz. But the land must not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. And in the Hebrew version of this responsa, I added an additional sentence from the Tractate of Sanhedrin, folio 39a. It's explaining Shemitah. It's explaining the sabbatical year. Ziru shesh ve'ashmitu sheva kidei shetedu she'aretz shelihu. Plant for 6 years, have sabbatical on the 7th, in order that you should know that this land is mine. In other words, that passage in the Talmud is building on the sentence, ki li kol haaretz, right? For the land is mine, and saying that is exactly why we do the sabbatical year, to remind us once every 7 years that this land does not belong to us, but belongs to God. A similar idea appears in Psalm 24, and this is a very famous psalm, L'Hashem ha'aretz umlo'ah, which we recite at various times of the year, including the high holidays, Shalosh Regalim, Sundays. Adonai ha'aretz umlo'ah teveh v'yoshveva. The earth is the Lord and all that it holds, the world and its inhabitants. And there's a beautiful custom which I follow, which I learned about in the 1970s, is that when you buy a book, you write inside the book, and you can see, if you can see behind me in my office, I'm surrounded by some 12,000 books. In every single book, I wrote the following: L'Hashem ha'aretz umlo'ah, the earth is the Lord's and all that it holds. And if you'd like to return this book, you can return it to David Golinkin. A beautiful custom. The idea being that even though I now own these books, Ad Me'av Esrim, at some future point, my children, my grandchildren, the Schechter Institute Library is going to own these books. And I'm writing in every book that every single thing in the world really belongs to God, and we are just passing through. So just as the Shemitah year emphasizes this principle, Ki li kol haaretz, for this land is mine, for the land is mine, so Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord and all that it holds, the world and its inhabitants. There is another beautiful psalm, which I'm not going to read with you, but you can all read it yourselves. If you'll open up any Tanakh to Psalm 104, which we recite, Baruch Nafshi on Rosh Chodesh, the psalm for the day on Rosh Chodesh, is a beautiful celebration of God's creation in great detail. Now, there is one verse which would seem to take the opposite approach. That's a very famous verse, found in Genesis chapter 1. God says to Adam and Eve, Pru uravu umilu et haaretz v'chifshua uredu bidgat hayam ubof hashamayim uv'chol chaya romeset al haaretz. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish and the sea, and the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. This verse seems to give human beings carte blanche to subdue the universe. We can subdue the earth, we can rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds of the sky, and every living thing. And indeed, as Rabbi Robert Gordas points out in his article about the Jewish view of ecology, the traditional Christian interpretation was that this verse gives us the right to exploit nature. Subdue the earth, rule over the fish, the birds, and all living things. However, those Christian theologians failed to notice that in the very next verse, verse 29, it says that Adam and Eve may eat only plants and trees. Permission to eat meat is given only in Genesis chapter 9. In other words, if we really had the right to subdue everything, the fish and the birds and so on and so forth, then Adam and Eve would have been given permission to eat everything. But that is not the case. So what does the chifshuha mean? What does to subdue the world mean? According to our sages, and you might not like this interpretation, but at least it saves the ecology or the environment. According to our sages in Yevamot, the chifshua comes to modify the first half of the verse. And the first half of the verse says, Peru uravu, right? Be fruitful and multiply. And since subduing enemies in war is primarily a male undertaking, the verb subdue teaches that the mitzvah of propagating the human race falls upon the male rather than upon the female. As according to the rabbis of the Talmud, men are required to fulfill the mitzvah of puravu because of the word v'chivshua and subdue it. Women are not required to fulfill the mitzvah of puravu. And in any case, in their reading, subdue it does not mean that we have the right to subdue the environment, to cut down all the trees in the Amazon, to kill all the lions in the world, and so on and so forth. According to Jewish law, in Yevamot and subsequent codes of Jewish law, we do not have the right to subdue the world in that fashion. So that is the first principle, that the world belongs to God, and we do not have the right to subdue every living creature. The second theological basis for ecology does not have a Hebrew term. The modern English term is stewardship. I just want to tell you what I called it in the Hebrew version of this responsum. So you should know that there is a Hebrew term in modern Hebrew. It's called hafkadah. And stewardship is found in Genesis chapter 2. The Lord took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to guard it. In other words, God put us in the Garden of Eden, not simply to have a good time, to enjoy the fruits of the Garden of Eden and to bask in the sun, but to till it and to guard it, to work the land and to protect the land. Or in modern English, we are stewards of the earth. Our job is to protect the earth, not simply to enjoy what's in the earth. And there's a famous midrash, which amazingly enough only appears in one place, in Kohelet Rabbah, which was edited in the land of Israel in the 6th century. And this is what this midrash says. When the Holy One, blessed be He, created Adam, He took him and made him pass before all the trees of the Garden of Eden. And He said to him, see my works, how lovely and how excellent they are. And everything that I have created for you I have created. Pay attention that you should not corrupt it. There was no one to fix it after you. If you remember what happened at Chernobyl some 20 years ago, and there have been similar nuclear accidents in other parts of the world, you understand exactly what this means. Pay attention that you should not corrupt it. There was no one to fix it after you. It's going to take hundreds of years for the land about Chernobyl to become normal land again that is not radioactive. And this midrash from the 6th century is saying that God says to Adam, here's a tour of Gan Eden, really lovely, beautiful, but your job is not to corrupt it. Your job is not to destroy it, because there is no one to fix it after you. The third reason for protecting the environment is not theological, but logical, simple common sense. And that is that a person who harms nature harms himself. And this idea appears in 2 rabbinic passages. And I really love this next passage from Bava Kama. I'm quoting from the Babylonian Talmud. There's a similar passage in the Tosefta. Our sages taught, a certain man was removing stones from his domain to the public domain. In other words, he was trying to get rid of the stones in his garden or his plot of land. He picks up the stones and he throws them in the street. When a chassid, a pious man, found him doing so and said to him, fool, the Hebrew term is much stronger. The Hebrew term says reka. Reka means empty head, a person with an empty head. Why do you remove stones from a domain that is not yours to a domain which is yours? Which seems totally illogical. He's saying you're throwing stones from a domain that is not yours, from your garden, into the street, which is yours. The man laughed at him. A while later, the man had to sell his field and was walking on the same public domain where he had put the stones. And he stumbled over the very same stones. He said to himself, the pious man was right when he said to me, why do you remove stones from a domain that is not yours to a domain which is yours? In other words, that man thought that his garden, his farm, was going to be his land for generations. And he's just dumping the stones in the public thoroughfare. But it turns out that he had to sell his land. It was no longer his land. And the public thoroughfare where he had thrown the stones, that was actually his land. And he tripped on the very same stones that he had thrown into Reshut Harabim, that he had thrown into the public thoroughfare. So the logic of this is very simple. When we dump our waste or our toxic waste in the public domain, we are the ones who are in the end going to suffer from the pollution that we spread. And a similar idea is expressed in a classic midrash, Vayikra Rabbah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai taught it can be compared to people who were in a boat, and one of them took a drill and began to drill under his seat. His fellow passengers said to him, "Why are you doing this?" He said to them, "What do you care? Am I not drilling under me? The hole is only under my seat. What do you care?" They replied, "Because you are sinking the boat with us in it." The world is like one boat, not one global village, but one boat. If one passenger drills a hole under a seat, we all sink. And the same idea, amazingly enough, was expressed by Senator Adlai Stevenson, one of the founders of the United Nations. We travel together, passengers on a little spaceship, dependent on its vulnerable reserves of air and soil, all committed for our safety to its security and peace, preserved from annihilation only by the care, the work, and the love we give our fragile craft. So Adlai Stevenson in the 1950s or 60s expressed a similar idea to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century, which is that we are all in the same boat traveling through space. If I drill a hole under my seat, we all sink. And now, with the few minutes I have left, I would like to point out 2 examples of environmental awareness in our tradition. The first is the idea of planting trees, which I already mentioned on Tu Bishvat. I'm sure you've heard of the 5th Zionist Congress, the founding of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. I know that we all buy tree certificates for children and grandchildren in honor of their bar or bat mitzvah. But this idea of planting trees did not start with the JNF. And it started in a number of rabbinic passages. I'll just give you one of them. It says in Deuteronomy 13:5, this is from Vayikra Rabbah again. After the Lord your God you shall walk. Is it possible for man of flesh and blood to walk after God? About God it says, Shehu Esh Ochla, is a consuming fire. Rather, in the beginning of creating the world, God's first action was to plant. As it is written, and the Lord God planted a tree, right? Vayita gan be'eden mikedim. Or eitz. So too, when you enter the land of Israel, make the planting of trees your first order of business. As it says in Leviticus, Ki tavo el haaretz unetatem kol eitz ma'achal. When you come into the land, you shall plant fruit trees. So by planting trees, we are imitatio Dei. We are imitating God. Just as God planted trees in the Garden of Eden, we plant trees when we enter the land of Israel. And the last concept, unfortunately, I have to skip a really nice story there. The last concept is the concept of Bal Tashrit, or as they say in Ashkenazis, Bal Tashris. Until today, throughout the world, when a Jewish child is about to waste some food or throw some food in the garbage, his parent says to him, Bal Tashrit or Bal Tashris, which means you're not allowed to wantonly destroy food or anything else. And this is, of course, based on the famous verse in Deuteronomy chapter 20, when you besiege a city for a long time, making war against it, you shall not destroy, Bal Tashrit, its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may eat from them, but must not cut them down, for are trees of the field human beings that they should be besieged by you? Only the fruit which you know are fruit-bearing, are not fruit-bearing, you may destroy, etc. In other words, you can destroy non-fruit trees in order to build the siege works. You may not destroy fruit trees, so says Deuteronomy chapter 20. However, the sages of the Talmud and Midrash expanded this prohibition, and we learn in Sifrei Dvarim in the Finkelstein edition that it comes to include diverting water from trees so that they should wither and die. Maimonides added, Hilchot Melachim, that the prohibition applies not just during a siege, but whenever a person cuts a fruit tree in a wanton fashion. He did not allow cutting down other rabbis, and in addition, the Rambam and others extended this not only to trees, but to other things as well. Whoever breaks vessels, or tears garments, or destroys a building, or clogs up a fountain, or does away with food in a destructive manner, violates the prohibition of Bal Tashrit. So we have seen here, in a bird's eye view, 5 basic concepts. Here, let me take this down. 5 basic concepts related to Judaism and ecology or the environment. Number 1, Ladonai haaretz umlo'ah, the earth belongs to God and not to us. We do not have the right to destroy it. Number 2, stewardship, that God put us in the Garden of Eden and on this planet to till it and to guard it. We have to guard it. We may not destroy it. Number 3, the logic. If we throw our garbage in the public thoroughfare, we are actually throwing our garbage in our own thoroughfare, and we will eventually trip on our own garbage. Number 4, the positive value of planting trees, as we do in Israel today. Number 5, the negative mitzvah of Bal Tashrit. You may not wantonly destroy anything, whether it be food, garments, plastic, and everything else. And I think that with these 5 concepts in mind, they will help us not only on Tu Bishvat, but throughout the year as we struggle with the pollution and the environmental dangers which I described in my introduction. Unfortunately, our time is up, and I will now pass the wand, the baton, to our next teacher, who is Dr. Perry Sinclair, the new Mankalit, the new Scott and Susan Shea, Director General of the Tali Education Fund. She officially took over from Dr. Eitan Shikli on June 1st. Needless to say, it's been a rather boring and uneventful time in our lives. And our hats off to Perry for dealing with the pandemic as she leads the Tali educational system with 65,000 children in Israel. And her topic is, how great are your works, O Lord, Tu Bishvat at home with Tali.